Hi everyone, this is Mr. Lloyd. Before you have your first writing assignment given to you, I wanted to make sure that we touch base on what is expected as far as MLA citation. So we're going to start with this brief presentation on citing your sources in the body of your essays. So this isn't your works cited page. We'll get to that later. This is essentially just introducing and then citing your sources with in-text citations, they're called. So this is MLA Source Documentation Part 1. So when you are using sources, one of the first things you want to do before you use a source is introduce it. So when you use a source for the first time, the idea is your reader, your audience doesn't necessarily know what that source is. They don't know whether it's a good source or why they should trust it as a good piece of evidence that you are offering. So the idea is whenever you use a source for the first time, you should introduce it in your sentence before you give a quotation or paraphrase any material from the source. Say where it's coming from. And this would be in your actual paragraph. So, for example, say you wanted to quote from something that I had written as your instructor, but say I was a big famous expert on writing. What you want to do is, as the example says, you say, as renowned writing expert Nathaniel Lloyd suggests, and then now since you have introduced the quotation, you put a comma, and whatever comes after that, it's going to need to be a complete thought. The quote that you offer needs to be a complete thought, and you open your quotations here, and you say, writing in the correct format during the initial drafting stage makes the entire process easier because it means fewer changes during the revision stage. Now, let's pretend that you had taken this quote from a book I wrote on writing, and it was on page 5 of that book. So this is the page number. And since you introduced the author here with my name leading into the quote, that means you don't need to put any other information in the citation except for the page number. You don't need to put anything in parentheses here except for the page number. And you don't use the word page. You don't put an abbreviation of the word page like PG or P, period, so anything like that. It's just the numeral, just the number 5. And you'll notice that the punctuation has moved. It would be here, right, inside the quotation marks. But you have a citation, so it has to come after that over here. Okay, so let's say you wanted to paraphrase this because you didn't like the way Nathaniel Lloyd said this, so you want to paraphrase it. You go over here. You can do the same introduction, essentially. You still want to introduce a source if you've never used it for the first time, but you are then going to put it all in your own words, and it would need to be completely in your own wording and your own sentence structure for it to be a true paraphrased material, true paraphrased piece of a source. So you still have, you say, according to renowned expert Nathaniel Lloyd, so you're still introducing it. That's important. You're still introducing it, and then you say, writers should format correctly in rough drafts so they won't have to worry about it in revision. So you've kind of simplified it by putting it into your own words, but you have still identified who the writer is. You have still indicated that you are, even though you're putting it in your own words, it's still from this source, and it's on page 5, and you would still need the page number here. Now, let's say that you have already introduced this source by me, by Nathaniel Lloyd. Later on, when you are using a quote again, when you've already introduced a source and maybe you want to use something else from the same source, you may not have to introduce it as thoroughly, right? You can still lead into a quote or a paraphrase even though you've already introduced it, and you don't need to call the writer the world-renowned expert, say who he is. You don't need to necessarily say what the title of the thing is again, or whatever you used to introduce the quote the first time. But you could still lead into it by saying just the last name Lloyd suggests, Lloyd also says, right? That's all you need to do once you've introduced it. But if you feel you don't, the information you're offering is it's not necessary to mention the author again and do the whole quote introduction because you've already done it. There is a way in MLA citation where you can do that. That's where the author's last name goes in there with in the parentheses with the page number. So it's going to say, writing in the correct format during the initial drafting stage makes the entire process easier because it means fewer changes during the revision stage. Now the last name of the author is in here with the page number, right? And notice there's no abbreviation for the word page, right? There's no punctuation. There's no comma between the last name and the page number. And likewise, if you paraphrase something and you put it in your own words like we showed before, it's going to be the same thing. You still, if you don't introduce that material that you're paraphrasing, if you don't introduce it by saying where the source is from or what source it's from, you are going to need to still mention the author's last name and the page number there. Now, you guys are going to come across a lot of sources that are online sources. Some of these online sources aren't going to have page numbers. If that's the case, you still need to introduce the source, introduce the author's name, introduce the title, right? And then you use your quote or paraphrase. But that means if you've already introduced it, there's no citation needed afterward. And the period at the end goes inside the quotes. And that's only because you don't have a page number to give. Now, if you need to put some information in the citation, you can still put the author's name if they have it. But if it's an online source and there's no author's name, what you're going to do is introduce it by the title, right? And that's something that can go in the parentheses as well. You can put a shortened version of the title because that's how it's going to be alphabetized on your Works Cited page. So we'll talk about the Works Cited page next.